All right, we're in 1 Timothy chapter 5, and we are beginning this section, and really it's kind of broken down into two paragraphs, if your Bible paragraphs, on widows, caring for widows. And the first thing Paul says here to Timothy is to honor widows who are widows indeed. I think the American Standard says, the New King James says, who are really widows. And keep in mind, of course, as we study these things in 1 Timothy, none of this is written in a vacuum. And certainly the Bible was written in such a way intended that the precepts apply to us just as those people did then. But certainly when we're studying and trying to understand that there is a context, there's something going on. Just like in this church, Timothy has been told to stand up to these false teachers. And so perhaps then some abuse here, either by those claiming to be widows or perhaps by family members who are refusing to take care of the family, trying to take advantage of the church in that respect. But this Greek word for widow is a kindred word to another Greek word that means robbed. And so a widow is one who's been what? Robbed of her husband, right. And so certainly we want to honor all godly widows, that is, respect and give them the treatment they deserve. But in this context, we're certainly talking about more than that. We're talking about providing not just emotional support, but even in this case, as we're going to see throughout this context, some financial support. But again, that's only for those who he terms as widows indeed, and it would appear then it's those who have probably, there's probably three major characteristics here as we go through the text. There's no prospect of marriage. They have no family, no Christian family, that is, to take care of them, to see to their needs. And then number three, they've devoted themselves to the service of God. And of course, as part of this honoring them, if you're going to take care of them financially, you're going to do so in a way that treats them with dignity. You're not going to make them feel bad for helping them. But there's some abuse, of course, that can take place anytime money's involved. There's always the possibility of abuse. It's amazing to me. I mean, people call the office, and I don't really specialize in probate and estate work. I draft some wills and I go to probate court, but I'm not a specialist in that area. That's not what my focus on. Just imagine how many, it's amazing how many people call me in today's society arguing over what somebody's left behind. And so people come into the office and they'll say, they want to do a will. And I say, well, what about your bank account? Well, you want to do that? Well, I've already got so-and-so on there because they help me pay my bills and all that. Maybe they got 3 children and one of them's on there helping them. I said, well, so-and-so's name's on there. When you understand under Tennessee law, when you die, everything in that account is theirs. It doesn't belong to the other two. It's all theirs. Well, that's okay. So-and-so knows what I want done with it. They'll divide it with the other two. And I said, no, they won't. They will not. They never do. I mean, people call and say, well, Mom and Dad left so-and-so on the account, help them with the bills, and now they've died and they won't split the money with me. I'm sorry, but that's what the law says. So it's just amazing what happens to people when money's involved. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, I think the King James there says nephews. That's not a good translation. In fact, that's the only translation that has nephews. I think all lexicons agree that should be grandchildren. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, the New King James says, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Well, again, we're going to inoculate against the abuse of this benevolence. And so if this widow has children, grandchildren, family, Christian family members, they first have to fulfill their responsibilities and take care of their family. That's what families are for. It says to repay. I think some translations, maybe the American Standard says to requite. But that Greek word there, Art and Gingrich translate, make a return to those who brought them up. That is, pay them back. Pay them back. They took care of you all those years, did all that for you. I mean, how many people we see in our modern day society that just... In fact, they not only don't take care of mom and dad, they actually try to take what mom and dad still has. I mean, grown people still living off their, parents. The English Standard and the New American Standard say make some return. That's pretty close to the Greek word there. And so it's the idea, though, of repaying a debt. We owe a debt to those who raised us, cared for us in this world. And so if you don't accept that responsibility, then, when you get down to verse 8, you find out that you're worse than a what? Which in more modern language, you're worse than an unbeliever. You're worse than a non-Christian. So, it kind of reminds you of Romans 1:31, right? These are, if you don't take care of your own family, it's, you're without natural affection. Really, it's not natural. And so, you're also unthankful, which we'll talk about in 2 Timothy chapter 3. Yeah.
I've often wondered about this, Brother Greg, is that taking care of our elderly, or our elderly parents in particular, has just never took root in our society like it has in Asia, for an example.
Well, I disagree with that to some extent. I mean, I think for all the years before we were a nation, and probably the first 100 years after we were a nation, I think people, extended families, lived together. I think they lived together, and of course it was a much more rural and agrarian society. But I also think that people, based on biblical concepts, did do that. But I think since, you're probably right, since maybe, I don't know, it's hard to say, but once you get into the 20th century, everybody moving off the farms and into the cities, and the world wars, and really the change in the economy, I think
the advent of the automobile really changed our society.
Yeah. So, there's no question. But just because you have scientific advancements and more modern conveniences doesn't relieve us of our responsibility to our family. And I think you can really attribute that more to our country as a whole just losing its moral fabric.
It seems to me that we have looked to government to provide what we lack.
Yeah, we'll talk about that too. That's been part of it too. As the government has become more socialistic, we just kind of forced it off on everybody. And so in fact, what ends up happening is me as a taxpayer, I end up taking care of somebody else's parents who I don't even know. Frankly, which is immoral, and as Brother, what's his name, Miller wrote in his book, God and Government, frankly, it's just government-sanctioned theft is all it is. Yeah.
No, I concur with what you're saying. Our society has obviously evolved, because at the time, if you were not part of a planet class, you didn't have a vote. So we've evolved. There's no two ways about that. However, one of the things that I've noticed is that when things get old, we don't want anything to do with it. We tend to shut it off. If it's a house, we tear it down. If it's a tree, we tear it down. I guess that's the issue that I've been.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's certainly people, we're kind of that way. And frankly, our society, our economically, as I've mentioned before, advertising and all that is always geared for people that are, 18 to 34. I mean, it's and frankly, we're pretty much letting the inmates run the asylum these days. I mean, whatever, 16, 17, 18-year-olds want. As if they know something.
I just heard on the news this morning, 13, 14, 15-year-old kids are in jail because of murdering somebody, stealing his car. 13, 14, 15.
Well, those are children without any family. They just know they've had no training, no parental guidance, no discipline. And I mean, again, this is a good passage to talk about how important the family is. I mean, the family is the oldest institution. I mean, it is the family is the bedrock of any society. I mean, if it falls apart, then so does the rest of your culture. And so notice he says, this is good. I think that word good is maybe not a lot of the good and acceptable, but all modern translations have the word acceptable. That's kind of an understatement. This is acceptable before God. It's not just acceptable. I mean, it's kind of an understatement on the part of the Holy Spirit here, but it's required. It's mandatory. So yeah, when he says it's acceptable, the bottom line is, in this context, Christians who have the means and then approach the elders for helping with their indigent family members don't understand Christianity and understand the God of heaven. The primary obligation is to the family, and we'll talk about that some more as we get down to verse later, about verse 16 or so. So he gets back and he focuses more on this widow who is known as the widow indeed. Verse 5, now she who is really a widow, the New King James says, and left alone. I think the King James says desolate, but that is, the word alone is the literal translation. Left alone is a good translation. Trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. Well, this widow is one that has no family to care for her. She's been left in a state of aloneness. No children, no husband, apparently no family at all to take care of her. But notice her hope rests where? Where does she place her hope?
God.
Yeah, in God. And she's involved in prayer. And certainly the Bible, and we're not going to go to all these passages, but Deuteronomy 10, Psalm 68, 146, you go throughout the Scriptures, God has always had a keen interest in widows and orphans. Anybody in society who is unable to take care of themselves, God has always taken an interest in. But that's the key as we talk about some of these issues with our society. The key is these are people who cannot take care of themselves. They're not necessarily the guy that I see standing at the top of the exit ramp with brand new tennis shoes on and some pretty good looking clothes with a sign that says, "Give me your money." Okay? Why? Why should I give you my money? I don't know. I mean, I don't know who this guy is, and I don't know. It looks to me he's pretty able-bodied. So, there's a lot of scammers out there. You have to be aware. He could have back problems. So he just stands or sits all day out there at the top of an overpass.
I saw one that had a sign that said, "Why lie? Need beer."
And people were giving him money. Well, they probably appreciated his truthfulness. I said, there's an honest beggar.
Now there's some parent says drug-free for 3 months or something.
Here's what we've done in this socialistic society. The government comes up with this phony thing they call the poverty level. And it depending on how many children you have, if you have 5, 6, 7, 8 children, you just keep popping them out. And you want the government to take care of them. I mean, I think that number can reach up to like 60,000 a year or something. You're still under, quote, the poverty line. And you know, you've got a couple of TVs and computers and internet and Wi-Fi. And just so you don't feel bad, food stamps now come in the form of what? A credit card. So you look like you have a credit card. And Brother Miller makes a pretty strong argument in his book from the Scriptures that in Bible times, God considered those who were really poor. Poor people were people who had no food, no clothes, no shelter. That was a poor person. Not 3 TVs, not 2 computers, not Wi-Fi, not a car, and all of that. So, and that's used to justify taking money from strangers and giving to somebody they don't even know. And by the way, and of course that's the attitude of the government, that is, it's really the government's money and we might let you keep a little bit of it. And we'll do with it what we want to. God says that money belongs to the individual who made it. You say, where do you get that? What did Peter tell Ananias and Sapphira?
Was it not yours?
And they weren't even forced. Now, nobody was forcing them to even give to the church or to fellow Christians. Nobody said, Ananias, you got to go out and sell that property and give it all the money to the church. Nobody told him that. Now, what they did was they sold it all. They wanted to be big and get all the praise that Barnabas got. And so they sold it, and they kept back part of it, but said, here's all of it. And Peter said, that was your property while you owned it. You didn't have to do that. And then once you sold it, it was still your money. So, but these widows indeed, they are more concerned about their service to the Lord, and that's their character. And then he contrasts the character of another type of widow, verse 6. You've got the one whose hope is on God. Then you've got the one, it says, who lives in pleasure, but is dead while she lives. Well, that word pleasure means to live luxuriously, self-indulgently. In fact, I think the English Standard Version uses the word self-indulgent. So, you can't really say for sure what that self-indulgence includes. Could it include some sexual sins? Yes, but that's not necessarily required here. But it conveys, according to one commentator, the idea of indulging oneself beyond the bounds of propriety, to live luxuriously and voluptuously. But we don't really get the specifics here. But he says she's dead, and that's in the perfect tense. She remains dead. Dead to who? Dead to what? What is she dead to? To God. She's in her relationship to God. She's still alive in her body, but she's dead. And by the way, death always in the Scriptures indicates some type of separation. It might be physical death, separation from the body and the spirit from the body. It could be spiritual death, that is, separation from God, as in this case. It could be eternal death, which is a final separation from God. But she's dead. And these things command that they may be blameless. We've looked at that word before, blameless in the Greek, without reproach, not open to censure. There is some disagreement among commentators of who the they is. And these things command that they may be blameless. Well, is the they the widows, or is the they the people that were refusing to support the widows and take care of them? Could be both, I suppose. There's some obligations here that are given for both. This obligation to care for your own family. But if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And so he narrows his focus from the they, the general people, to those individuals who will not provide. That Greek word there, porneo, relates the dual ideas of planning ahead, implementing the plan. And so again, I mean, just like when our parents took care of us as children, we have an obligation to take care of them. And that means regardless of the sacrifices that have to be made. Sometimes people say, well, you know, it's expensive. Well, yeah, it is expensive. It's expensive to rear children.
Greg?
Yeah.
Is a Christian obligated every time he pulls up to a stop sign, somebody's there with a sign? Is a Christian obligated to give those people money every time?
No, I don't see how we can obligate ourselves to do that every time. I think everybody has to make these choices for themselves. I mean, certainly, if we know somebody that's in a legitimate need, I mean, we have an obligation to help them. You know, helping people, whether or not I should help someone that I can't determine whether they really need help or not, I guess that's kind of within my discretion. And you know, maybe I don't Maybe I'm doing it wrong, but sometimes I give money to people I see downtown. But usually I can tell these people, I doubt they can hold a job. I mean, I can tell you can tell when somebody's got mental handicaps, or physical handicaps, such that they may not can help the condition they're in. Now, the downside to that is I don't know what they're spending the money on. And that's another problem. But again, am I to be held accountable for that? I mean, if I out of the goodness of my heart give you some money because you say you need it for food, and then you go out and you buy alcohol, well, I mean, I can't really control everything everybody does after they're out of my sight. I mean, I've had people come up to me at service stations wanting gas. We've had people stop by the building here and say, oh, I had an emergency come up, and I'm from Macon, Georgia, and I'm driving to Omaha, Nebraska, and I don't have any money. I've run out of gas, and I need gas. And I look at them and I say, so let me get this straight. You had to go to Omaha, Nebraska, and you left from Macon, Georgia, not knowing whether or not you had enough gas or money to make it? So what you're telling me is you left home or you left wherever you were living knowing that when you got on the road, you were going to have to ask other people for money. No, sir, you're not getting a dime from me. That's just wrong. Don't make the trip. I don't care what kind of emergency it is. It's crazy. Now, when I've had the time, I've actually bought some people some stuff. The problem is they usually catch you when you don't have the time. I mean, I've walked down the mall before, and some couples say, well, we hadn't been able to eat with anything. I said, well, fine, we'll walk into the grocery store here, and I'll get you a loaf of bread and some bologna and whatever, and they've taken it. I've offered that to other people, and they've cussed me out and walked off.
You want the cash.
Because they didn't want any food, they wanted my money. So, we just have to use our best judgment. Two levels of responsibility are mentioned here. He says if he doesn't take care of his own and what? Especially those of his own household. So really you've got the idea of it would seem here his own household would be more of your nuclear family, and then maybe his own, kind of even extended family. Now there'd be some judgment on that, as to how far that extends. Well, what is he denied? Repudiated. Well, what does it say? He's denied what?
The faith.
The faith. There's that objective term again. The gospel system, the Christian system. He's not talking about his personal faith, personal trust in God, but the faith. And is worse than an unbeliever. In other words, a non-Christian. The presumption here is kind of that, look, even heathen people, or even decent heathen people, I think Paul's saying here, they take care of themselves. I mean, they take care of their own families. They're decent people. Kind of reminds me of when Paul was shipwrecked on Malta. He said the pagans were anybody who weren't Greeks, educated. I don't know if they were, I don't know if they were natives, like in the sense we think of that, but it says, they showed us no little kindness. I mean, they weren't Christians, but even people in the world can show kindness to those that they love and care for, and so, certainly it's enjoined upon us to do at least that much. And again, we still get back to this same thing that we always do. It's amazing. It's amazing how you can be a Calvinist when almost every verse in the New Testament talks about the fact that a Christian can lose his salvation if he's not careful. What does this say? He's worse than what? Well, if I'm worse than an unbeliever, if I'm worse than a non-Christian, what does that say about my soul? So you're telling me that I'm worse than a non-Christian, but once saved, I'm always saved. That makes no sense. Well, now we talk about a different set. We're Still talking about widows, but beginning in verse 9, we've got this long section that discusses, I guess what you would call those that are enrolled, or taken into the number, that is, they're on the list. That taken into the number is all one word in the Greek. It was used by ancient writers for the enrolling of soldiers. So enrolled is a good term. Let's read this section. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she had been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she had brought up children, if she had lodged strangers, if she had washed the saints' feet, if she had relieved the afflicted, if she had diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows. That means don't enroll them. That means, treat them bad. For when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith, or their pledge, their promise. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, and not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies. I think the King James there's this tattlers, but gossips is a good translation. Saying things which they ought not to. Therefore, I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, actually that should say, probably in all the later translations, including the American Standard, man is not in the text. If any believing woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened. Then they relieve those who are really widows, or widows indeed. So we're now talking about a certain class whom he described as the enrolled. By the way, that Greek word, K-A-T-A-L-E-G-O, is the basis of our word catalog. That kind of makes sense, catalog things. So they're listed in a certain place, and there's certain qualifications, and those qualifications, for you to be one of these widows, is basically divided into 3 categories. Age, what else? Marital status, and then what's the third, which he talks about quite a bit? Yeah, their service. You basically got 3 categories, 3 requirements: age, marital status, and service. So, it's interesting, commentators in the, denominational world, and I mean, I'm talking about smart people, kind of disagree on who this group is. I like what Earl says in his. He's got a nice little summary of this in his word meanings in the New Testament. He says there's been a great deal of discussion as to whether there was an official order of widows in the New Testament church, and that's true. That's in a lot of the commentaries. Vincent writes, the fathers from the end of the 2nd century to the 4th recognized a class known as, I can't pronounce this word, who had oversight of certain women that had oversight of the female church members in a separate seat in the congregation. And the Council of Laodicea supposedly abolished this institution. Moffat says, however, in the references to widows in the earliest Christian literature outside the New Testament, with one exception, they are mentioned as objects of charity along with orphans. None of these places hints at an order of widows. The bottom line is, there's no such thing as widows that are like elders over other women in the church. That's just not the case. But that's not to say that these women didn't go about taking on different services or works. I mean, this group of widows that are being cared for in this, being enrolled, it would appear to me, based on the context, remember the ones that he says refuse, if they go about from house to house, they're going to do what?
Gossip.
They're going to gossip and stir up trouble. So in that context, it would appear to me at least that these widows that the church is taking care of do have some work to do. Maybe they are going from house to house and helping people with different things, but they're not some special order, and they're not a head over anybody or anything like that.
Titus just speaks of a class of women that were older women that were to teach.
Yeah,
The younger women.
to teach the younger women, and so
Widows as well.
similar situation here. So, first the age, 60 years of age, well, that eliminates, eliminates the widows who either could, one, probably still support themselves, or be inclined to do what?
Remarried.
Remarry. Yeah. Yeah, the younger you are, when you become a widow, the more likely it is you're going to remarry. And then there's a moral element, wife of one man. Now, all commentators agree that that doesn't mean that they could have only been married once. That means you'd have to refuse somebody that was never married, or perhaps had been remarried scripturally and then now was a widow. But it really has more to do with her sexual fidelity in her marriage. That is, she was faithful to one man. And then, beginning in verse 10, it talks about her characteristic of industry and benevolence. She's got a good reputation that when it comes to, it says, well reported for what? Good works. She's brought up children. That doesn't just mean she had children. Okay? A little more to it than that. Anybody can have children. Brother Rufus left just when he would want to get in on this discussion. I mean, we got 12 and 13-year-olds having children, popping them out right and left so they can collect a government check. And no fathers. So anybody can do that. We're talking about, the emphasis here is on the manner in which she's reared her children. She's taken care of them physically and spiritually. Brought them up correctly. And then she has to be one that's shown some hospitality to strangers. If she's lodged strangers, well, I would think that certainly when her husband was alive, they were probably hospitable to Christians who were traveling, missionaries, other people of that sort. Wash the saints' feet. And we see this phrase, washing of feet, is used really to, what was the deal with feet washing in the first century anyway? I mean, they didn't have shoes like we've got, sure. I mean, they wore sandals, and they didn't ride in cars. They walked. Dirt roads, paths. So they're tired and their feet are dirty, and so certainly it was customary in that culture to wash the visitors' feet. But that chore was usually done by people that had any money at all. By who? Servants. Yeah, that was the job of a household servant. So the expression is, what's that word we like to use? Synecdoche. Specific for the general, it is an indication. Someone who's willing to wash feet is someone who has a general disposition for servants. There is nothing in the New Testament that teaches that this is some kind of church ordinance. In fact, in our culture, it's just a dumb to think it to be a church. And so, in fact, I think it was unknown as a church ordinance until probably the time of Augustine. But it is a figure of speech that indicates one who's serving in their attitude, personality. And she has to relieve the afflicted, that is, that word indicates those who are under some kind of pressure. Maybe it's persecution, whatever, some sort. Could be financial, I suppose, or could be emotional, spiritual support, financial support. And if she has diligently followed every good work, diligently followed, it means to follow closely upon. So, keep in mind as we go through this, I think there's something to be learned, though, for us. We've got a specific situation, obviously, going on in Ephesus, either that's being abused in one direction or the other. Either somebody's not taking care of their family, or they're trying to slough it off on the church when it shouldn't be done that way. But there is, I think, an indication to us that, we need to be willing to take care of probably anybody that's in real need. Especially, according to Galatians chapter 6, especially of those that are of the household of faith. I can go into John's epistles, and he says, well, how can you love God, but you don't love your brother? James said, what? About taking care of those that are in need. Pure religion, undefiled, you know. And so we have an obligation, not just the widows, well, that's the context here, but we have an obligation just to take care of people that have a genuine need, and certainly if they're the household of faith. I have never understood the whole anti-position on this. That, you know, you can't use money out of the church treasury to help somebody in need. I mean, it says, you know, we're to take care of the widows and the orphans. And you know, you can extrapolate from that people that are in need. So this whole business of, well, I got to distinguish between my personal pocketbook and the church's pocketbook, I don't understand it. But verse 11, younger widows are what? Be what? Refused. And that just means not added to the enrollment for church support. And there's reasons for that. There's reasons for that. They're young, and they may have a desire to marry. And let's see, it says they grow wanton in the New King James. I think the King James says wax wanton. That verb literally means to feel the impulses of sexual desire, according to Thayer. Hart and Gingrich translate the clause when they feel sensuous impulses that alienate them from Christ. Another commentator, grow physically restless and so restive against the limitations of Christian widowhood. Hendrickson thinks the evil desire is not necessarily indicated here. It's natural for young widows to wish to remarry, but the problem, of course, is they may be more concerned about finding a husband than taking care of their responsibilities. And then once they do, there seems to me an indication. It says they cast off their first faith. That could be translated their pledge, their promise. It seems to me that those that have been taken into this list, those that have been enrolled, have made a pledge. They've made a promise that we're going to go about, as part of this group, we're going to go about doing the Lord's work. Now she's gone back on her promise, on her pledge. And so certainly it's natural for the younger the widow is to want some physical companionship. Nothing wrong with that. But don't enroll them, because that's probably what they're going to want to do. So wait till they qualify. Because for these two reasons. One, they're going to wish to marry. And of course, I guess their younger age makes them more susceptible to these kinds of temptations as well. This clause, having condemnation because they've rejected their first pledge, I kind of tend to think I think they did pledge. I think it has more to do with the pledge here. I'm not going to remarry. I'm going to be about this service. Now, there's some that disagree and think that, well, maybe they just, because of their nature and their wanting to fulfill their sexual desires, maybe they've actually gone off into sin, and so they've actually cast off the faith. I mean, their faith in Christ. I don't know. I kind of find that a little you got a comment on that? I mean, just in the context, it appears to me that maybe they did make a promise or pledge that they've gone back on. I don't know that I would assume that they've gone off into sin here. And of course, the King James uses the word damnation, but that's a little strong. The Greek word literally means judgment, and so that's why you see the New King James using the word condemnation. Well, what else do they do? What's another potential problem? These younger widows, they got all this energy.
Dead and about.
Yeah, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Now, keep in mind that they're meddling into these matters that don't concern them, that could damage the local church. But let's go back to our context. Paul is writing to Timothy to deal with who? He's dealing with some false teachers in the church at Ephesus. So maybe, you know, there's a danger here for these younger widows. They're going from house to house, gossiping, causing damage. Perhaps they've even come under the influence of these teachers. Maybe they're a right group for these false teachers to stir up, use them to cause problems. in the congregation there, perhaps. We never can get too far away from the fact that Timothy is to deal with these false teachers. And they might not even know it. They may be in league with the false teachers even unwittingly. Maybe they're being used. You ever seen anybody in the church get used by a false teacher? Happens all the time. Get sucked in. Not know it. It's possible. So, Paul has a desire here. And remember what we said about an apostolic desire. It's usually more than a desire. Now, sometimes it's a command. Sometimes it is just his. You go into 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Sometimes it can be his advice. Sometimes it can be a command. Like we go back to chapter 2, verse 8. But we don't take any desire of an inspired apostle lightly. And certainly if it's based on scriptural precedent, it's binding. And even if it's just his advice and not an absolute requirement, it's still something to listen to. And so sometimes people get bent out of shape because here he's telling younger women, widows to marry, and you go back into the Corinthian epistle and he tells people to do what? Don't get married, right? 1 Corinthians chapter 7, of course, what was the difference? What was the difference? Different situations, right? What was going on in the Corinthian letter when he told them, don't get married. Stay like I am. What was going on? Persecution, yeah, persecution. It was going to be more difficult in a marriage or family situation. It'd be easier to get through this persecution for you probably if you stay single, but that's not the situation. So a totally different situation, so the advice is different. He's trying to take care of a particular problem here. And you know, it's funny, and I like what one commentator said. You know, the Holy Spirit he can be subtle sometimes through Paul. But he could be making a backhanded slap at who, again here, when he says, I desire that the younger widows marry. Well, who's he giving a backhanded slap here also? Go back to chapter 4, verse 3. The false teachers were doing what? Forbidding to marry. Now here you got false teachers in the congregation forbidding to marry. And here's Paul, the Holy Spirit through Paul saying, get married. So it's just kind of interesting how that works. God's pretty smart. Right? That's the battle. I really thought we were going to finish widows today. And I almost did. We'll finish up this discussion and get into elders again. Can't get away from that. Verse 17.